Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll probably remember that last week we brought you the chilling story of the Polish writer turned murderer, Krystian Bala. At the end of the video, we mentioned that we actually had intended for the case to be part of a larger list of stories on a similar theme, and asked you to let us know if you'd be interested in us covering some of these stories in the future. The response we got was overwhelmingly positive, so much so that we decided that instead of waiting, we'd push forward with the idea right away. So, without any further delay, here are two crime writers who turned out to be actual criminals. Just before we get into this first one, we wanted to offer something of a disclaimer. As this story took place in China and we can neither read nor speak the language, we've had to rely almost exclusively on either second-hand English sources or roughly translated primary ones. Both obviously have their shortcomings, but we notice that the English language sources in particular seem to have a number of discrepancies in their reporting. We've tried to point out areas where details are disputed, but nonetheless, we wanted to let you know for the sake of full disclosure. Also, apologies for our pronunciation. We did our best, but some of these we weren't even able to find pronunciation guides for, so we had to guess. Anyway, let's get into it. In a small neighborhood called Shengshe, in the Chinese city of Huzhou, there sits a 3-story concrete building next to one of the local roads. The building is fairly unassuming, and according to reports, these days houses a small business that sells electric vehicles. However, that wasn't always the case. In fact, it was once a small family hotel. However, all of that was changed nearly 30 years ago, when it was the site of a terrifying and brutal crime, one that would go unsolved for more than 2 decades. The story begins back near the end of 1995, when the building in question was known as the Minji Family Guest House. Though officially labeled as a hotel, reports we came across suggest that the business was a simple family operation, one that offered food as well as temporary lodging, and whose accommodations would have been closer to a hostel than what we in the West would typically think of as a hotel. It was run by a husband and wife named Min and Chen. On the night of November 29th, 2 men checked into the hotel and were put in a shared room on the 2nd floor, where at least one other guest was already staying. The men's names were Liu Youngbao and Wang Muming. Though Liu and Wang likely seemed like any other guests at the family-run hotel, little did the owners know that this could not have been further from the case. It was a mistake that would cost them their lives. While reports give numerous and at times contradictory accounts about what happened that fateful night, we know that a disturbing series of events were set in motion when Liu and Wang tried to steal from one of the other guests at the hotel. This had, in fact, been their intention from the start. At the time, Liu was a struggling writer, and Wang had been working in the local area for 2 years but had found limited financial success. Desperately in need of money, the pair decided that they would check into the Minji family guest house to find themselves someone to rob, ideally someone wealthy. They waited until everyone was asleep, believing that this would be the best time to strike. Unfortunately, this is where things get a little fuzzy. Most reports state that Liu and Wang selected a man named Yu Mufeng as their target. However, others say that Yu merely caught them in the act of robbing another guest. In either case, as the 2 men were carrying out their plans, things went sideways, and Yu realized what was happening. Liu and Wang responded by viciously beating him to death with clubs and a hammer. Most sources state that the robbery netted the 2 men an inexpensive watch and ring, as well as an amount of cash equivalent to about $1.50 US. However, before the men could even contemplate the murder that they had just carried out for so little material gain, they realized that they had another problem. The brutal crime had attracted the attention of the hotel's 2 owners, as well as their 13-year-old grandson. Deciding that they now needed to cover up what they had done, Liu and Wang tied up the family members before killing all three of them in the same horrific manner in which they had murdered Yu. By the time the grisly crime scene was uncovered, it was the next day, and Liu and Wang were long gone. All that was left behind were a few pieces of physical evidence, including some used towels, shoe prints, and a cigarette butt. Unfortunately, these were of little help to police due to the limited forensics technology that they had available to them at the time. At least one witness was able to give a description of Liu and Wang to investigators, identifying them as guests that had stayed at the hotel the night before. However, because neither of the men had any personal connection to the victims, no one was able to make an identification. Adding to the police's frustration was the fact that Min and Chen had not kept any records or information about their guests, and the building was not equipped with any security cameras. As a result, the haunting quadruple murder case soon went cold. In the meantime, Liu and Wang went on with their lives, with both of their fortunes ironically improving drastically in the intervening years. Wang reportedly moved to Shanghai and began to manage a business that his brother had invested in. Liu returned to his home in the neighboring province of Anhui, where his writing career eventually started to take off. Coming from a poor economic background, Liu reportedly wrote about what he knew, with many of his novels focusing on people at the bottom rungs of society. According to local sources, many of these stories, especially the ones about crime, included graphic descriptions of violence. Little did any of Liu's readers know that these dark passages were inspired by his memories of the real-life murders of 4 people that he had committed. The most disturbing crossover between Liu's fictional work and his real life, however, came in 2010, when he included a preface in his new novel entitled The Guilty Secret. In it, he wrote about his desire to start working on a new story, one about a female writer who gets away with committing a series of murders. He said that the tentative title was The Beautiful Writer Who Killed. It doesn't appear that he ever followed through with writing this novel, though just knowing that he was thinking about it is chilling enough if you ask us. Meanwhile, Liu was really starting to earn recognition for his work, getting accepted into the prestigious Chinese Writers Association, and even winning the Anhui Literature Award, highly regarded as the province's top achievement for any author. It wasn't until the summer of 2017, nearly 22 years after the brutal murders at the Minji family guest house, that authorities would finally turn the tables on Liu. It began when authorities reopened the investigation in June of that year, this time with the hopes that new technology, particularly advancements in DNA techniques, would lead to a break in the case. The investigative team's first success came when they managed to extract a DNA profile belonging to an unknown male suspect from the cigarette butt found at the 1995 crime scene. This sample was compared with over 60,000 people until authorities discovered a match to a clan of people in Nanling, a county located in southeast Anhui province. The clan's last name was Liu. From here, detectives interviewed people until they felt that they had zeroed in on a single likely suspect, the now 53-year-old acclaimed novelist Liu Youngbao. When investigators finally approached Liu, they asked for a sample of his saliva, saying that they were collecting these kinds of samples to map the family trees of people in the local area. Liu handed over his DNA without protest, and when analysis came back, it was shown to be a match to the evidence found at the 1995 crime scene. When police arrested Liu at his home on August 11th, he revealed that they need not have bothered trying to trick him when they collected his saliva. He said he knew why they had been there, and that he had been waiting for them all these years. Before his arrest, he had even taken the time to write a note to his wife explaining the situation, which he handed over right before being taken away. He also phoned his old friend Wang and told him to prepare to face up to what they had done. Wang was arrested several hours later, that same day. During subsequent interviews with police, Liu claimed that he had been haunted by what he had done from the moment he and Wang had committed their horrific crime. He also admitted that the crimes had inspired his literary work, though alleged that he had never based any of his characters directly on the victims. Finally, he said that he was ready to end his spiritual torment, and that he knew that the murders he had committed were so cruel that he deserved to die 100 times for them. The following year, both Liu and Wang pleaded guilty to robbery and murder, and were sentenced to death. While this is where all of the English language sources we were able to find about the case ended, we were able to track down one more Chinese article that we read using Google Translate. That source claimed that Liu and Wang were executed in October of 2019. To virtually everyone who knew them, 63-year-old Daniel Brophy and his wife, 67-year-old Nancy Crampton Brophy, seemed like the picture of a happy couple. They lived in a modest home on a half-acre plot of land in the West Portland suburb of Beaverton, and were well liked by their neighbors. They were the kind of people who would occasionally drop by with homemade baked goods, and could often be seen walking their 2 dogs together around the neighborhood, a pair of Shih Tzus named PB and J. Though it was a simple life, it was one that allowed both Daniel and Nancy to explore the things that they were truly passionate about. For Daniel, this was food. He had spent almost his entire life cooking, and after working in a few restaurants, had become an instructor at a couple of different local culinary schools. He had worked his way up through the ranks, until eventually he was made lead chef instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute. When he wasn't teaching at the school, he was busy growing food in his garden, raising chickens and turkeys in the backyard, or foraging for mushrooms. As for Nancy, she had bounced around between several different careers in her life, at one time running a catering business, and later selling life insurance and Medicare policies on commission. However, her true passion was writing fiction. In particular, Nancy wrote romantic suspense/crime novels, the kind that always seemed to involve a female protagonist trying to escape from some sort of harrowing yet thrilling situation, only to find herself inevitably driven into the arms of a steamy new love interest in the process. In Nancy's own words, she described her writing this way, quote, "My stories are about pretty men and strong women, about families that don't always work, and about the joy of finding love and the difficulty of making it stay." For most of their time together, Nancy and Daniel's relationship was nothing like the dramatic fictional worlds that she created for her characters. They had met by chance after Nancy moved from Texas to Oregon in the early 1990s, following the end of her first marriage. At the time, she was looking for a fresh start, and had enrolled at the Western Culinary Institute in Portland. During her first class, Daniel just so happened to be her instructor. The two remained friends at first, eventually getting married after the relationship gradually shifted to a romantic one. However, all of that would change in the late spring of 2018, when something happened that would forever blur the lines between reality and fiction. On the morning of June 2nd, 2018, Daniel left his home and set out for work at the Oregon Culinary Institute. The school's campus was located a little under a 20-minute drive away in Portland's Goose Hollow neighborhood. Though it was a Saturday, the school offered weekend courses, so that day, as he always did, Daniel headed to the campus early to get things ready for his students. At 7:21 a.m., Daniel disarmed the school's alarm system and made his way inside. About 10 minutes later, one of his colleagues arrived. She didn't interact with Daniel, who she knew would be in one of the building's rear kitchens doing prep work, and instead opened the doors in anticipation of the arrival of students. However, when the first of these students did arrive just after 8, they made a horrifying discovery. Daniel was lying in a pool of blood in the kitchen where he had been working. By the time emergency responders arrived at the scene, it was too late. Daniel was dead. An autopsy revealed that Daniel Brophy had been shot twice, once in the back and once in the chest at close range. Both bullets had pierced his heart. Based on these injuries, it was theorized that the 63-year-old chef had been taken by surprise. The first shot had hit him as he was standing at a sink filling ice and water buckets for his students. The second had hit him as he had turned around to face his killer. Despite the case being an obvious homicide, investigators were nonetheless puzzled by the crime scene. None of Daniel's possessions, including his wallet, keys, cell phone, or vehicle, were missing, meaning that robbery was not the likely motive. There was no sign of forced entry into the kitchen area either, nor were there any signs of a struggle. Aside from all of this, no one could think of anyone who would want Daniel dead, or for what possible reason. Understandably, news of Daniel's death hit those that knew him extremely hard. Many of his students described him as an irreplaceable mentor, one who could be tough and blunt, but who was kind at his core and extremely passionate about what he did. He didn't shy away from tough conversations and would be honest with students who he didn't think were cut out for culinary school, but his humor and wit always kept people aware that he had their best interests at heart. Though not as outwardly emotional as some of the other people in Daniel's life, Nancy was quick to publicly share the sense of devastation she felt about the loss of her husband. In a Facebook post the day after the crime, she wrote, quote, "For those of you who are close to me and feel this deserved a phone call, you are right, but I'm struggling to make sense of everything right now. While I appreciate all of your loving responses, I am overwhelmed. Please save phone calls for a few days until I can function." When friends and neighbors did interact with Nancy over the following days and weeks, they explained her disposition as one of shock, seemingly incapable of processing what had happened. She told one neighbor just a few weeks after the murder that she was thinking about moving because she was haunted by the memories of Daniel in the house. Everyone was worried about Nancy until 3 months later on September 5th, when police showed up at her Beaverton residence and placed her under arrest. Though this came out of nowhere in the eyes of many, as she was being taken into custody, Nancy reportedly said, quote, "You must think I murdered my husband." It turned out that this is precisely what detectives thought. Though their case was circumstantial, they believed it was compelling nonetheless, and that all signs pointed to Nancy being responsible for her husband's murder. For starters, investigators pointed out that Nancy and Daniel's financial situation was far more tenuous than it had appeared to those around them. While Daniel made a respectable $50,000 to $60,000 a year teaching, it wasn't enough for them to live off of. Things had been better when Nancy had run her catering business, but she had decided to shut that down in the early 2000s, partly because of the physical strain it took on her to run it, and partly because the company experienced a rough patch that forced her to significantly downsize her staff. As for Nancy's novels, they were self-published, and though they had found some modest success online, they were by no means big sellers. By the end of 2017, the couple's situation was so dire that they were forced to cash in tens of thousands of Daniel's retirement savings just to pay off their credit card debt. Curiously, though, no matter what financial hardships the couple were facing, authorities noticed during their investigation that there was one expense that was never trimmed: the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of life insurance coverage that they had on Daniel. This was despite the fact that their life insurance premiums were costing them over $1,000 a month. Now that Daniel was dead, Nancy stood to gain an estimated $1.4 million. Not only did this seem like motive enough for murder to investigators, they believed that they had direct evidence of Nancy following through with this plan. Just 3 days after Daniel's death, she reportedly called up a detective working on the case and asked for a letter confirming that she was not a suspect. She said that she wanted the letter so that she could hand it over to her insurance company. Authorities would later argue that this request was part of a larger pattern of suspicious behavior that Nancy exhibited after Daniel's death, which did not seem consistent with that of a grieving widow. For instance, they wondered, why had one of her first actions after Daniel's murder been to get rid of the chickens that he loved so much and had raised and cared for? They further alleged that the reason Nancy hadn't appeared outwardly emotional after Daniel's death was because she was responsible. What many had attributed to shock, they argued, was actually just nerves, as she waited to move on to the next stage of her plan. Aside from an alleged motive, police presented what they believed were the two most concrete pieces of evidence linking Nancy to the case. The first was 2 pieces of surveillance footage from the morning of Daniel's murder that showed a vehicle matching Nancy's minivan driving outside of the Oregon Culinary Institute. The first recording showed her driving directly in front of the school a few minutes after 7 a.m. The second showed her leaving the area in the crucial window of time between when Daniel entered the kitchen and when his colleague arrived on the campus, roughly 10 minutes later. This evidence contradicted what Nancy had originally told police when questioned following her husband's death, that she had been at home all morning until being notified about his murder. When confronted with the evidence of her being captured on video in the area near the crime scene, she reportedly stated that she did not remember that trip and that she must have suffered memory loss due to the shock of everything that had happened. The second piece of evidence police uncovered against Nancy had to do with one of the only physical clues found at the crime scene: 2 shell casings from a 9mm handgun. Though there were no fingerprints on either of the casings, police were able to determine that they had most likely been fired from a Glock. During their investigation, detectives uncovered that Nancy had purchased a so-called ghost gun kit, as well as a Glock handgun at a gun show. She had also bought an extra slide and barrel for the gun on eBay. While the ghost gun kit and Glock were recovered, the extra slide and barrel were never found. Authorities theorized that Nancy had purchased the ghost gun kit first, knowing that it was untraceable, but had abandoned the idea of using it as a murder weapon upon realizing that she was too inexperienced to properly assemble it. She then got the other gun, switched out the barrel and slide with the one that she had purchased online, and then carried out the shooting before switching the original slide and barrel back and disposing of the ones that had been used in the crime. For her part, Nancy argued that the guns had been purchased with the full knowledge and blessing of her husband, and rather than being murder weapons, had been bought for research purposes for her writing. She said that she often bought stuff like this in order to add to the accuracy and realism of her novels. Detectives argued that this was a two-way street, and therefore showed that she had the knowledge not only to carry out the crime as they had described, but also to know how to cover her tracks. Several days after her arrest, on September 13th, Nancy was indicted by a grand jury on 1 count of murder with a firearm constituting domestic violence. She pleaded not guilty. When news of the charges against Nancy broke, the case instantly generated headlines both across the country and internationally, especially when journalists started to take a closer look at Nancy's writing. The details of Daniel Brophy's murder seemed like they could have been lifted straight from the pages of one of his wife's salacious romantic suspense novels, especially her main series of books, which she referred to as the Wrong series. Each title in the series is a different spin on the same concept, i.e., the wrong brother, the wrong husband, the wrong lover, etc. All of the books in the series featured the same tagline, quote, "Wrong never felt so right." By far the piece of writing that got the most coverage, though, was an obscure blog post that Nancy had written back in 2011 for someone else's website. It was entitled, "How to Murder Your Husband." The post discussed several motives as well as methods for killing one's spouse, as well as commentary for each little point. It opened with the paragraph, quote, "As a romantic suspense writer, I spend a lot of time thinking about murder and consequently about police procedure. After all, if the murder is supposed to set me free, I certainly don't want to spend any time in jail. And let me say clearly for the record, I don't like jumpsuits, and orange isn't my color." Though the article was clearly meant to be cheeky at the time it was written, it obviously took on a much different context when it surfaced after Nancy was charged with Daniel's murder. This is particularly true when you consider that the very first motive she covered in the post was financial, even going so far as to include after it in brackets, "This is big." She went on to write in part, quote, "Divorce is expensive, and do you really want to split your possessions? Or if you married for money, aren't you entitled to all of it? The drawback is police aren't stupid. They are looking at you first. So you have to be organized, ruthless, and very clever." By far the most chilling part of the article is towards the end, though, where Nancy appears to momentarily break from the hypothetical, saying, quote, "I find it is easier to wish people dead than to actually kill them. I don't want to worry about blood and brains splattered on my walls. And really, I'm not good at remembering lies. But the thing I know about murder is that every one of us has it in them when pushed far enough." When Nancy finally went to trial in April of 2022, it was decided early on by the judge that the How to Murder Your Husband blog post would not be allowed into evidence. In particular, it was ruled that since the article had been written years prior, that any insights that it might provide were substantially outweighed by the danger that it might unfairly prejudice the jury. As it turned out, this ultimately didn't matter, as at the end of the 4-week trial, the jury found Nancy guilty of second-degree murder anyway. On June 13th, 2022, nearly 4 years to the day that Daniel Brophy was murdered, Nancy was sentenced to life in prison for the crime. According to inmate records we could find, she is currently being held at the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. That brings us to the end of today's video. Believe it or not, there are actually still a couple of cases that we came across in our research that are similar to these that we didn't get a chance to include in this list. We'll most likely move on from this topic next week to keep things interesting, but if you do want us to revisit these kinds of stories in the future, be sure to let us know in the comments section below. Also, if you find our videos interesting and informative and haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. And as always, thank you for watching.